I am here today with my grandparents Tom and Ellen Farrell. They are going to talk about their World War II experiences. So, how old were each of you during the war?
I was a little kid between the ages of about 8 and 11 and 12.
I was 15.
What were your memories of that time?
Well, that time when the war started, I remember when they dropped a bomb on Pearl Harbor. And then the war started, and I had two brothers that were drafted, and they went to war. They were both Navy men. One of them landed on Normandy Beach, and the other was in the South Pacific. But the one that had landed on Normandy Beach, they thought the German troops that was up on the land was further down from actually where they were landing, which wasn't so, because the Germans actually started shooting at these, and these men were falling out of these ships, and they were all over the place. And my brother Bobby pulled in when they were LSTs, they call them, landing craft. And when they dropped the troops off, when they started backing out, all these young men in the water screaming for mercy, begging for them to be picked up. And they could not pick up because there was another 1,000 all kinds of ships and all the men that had to come in there. And they had to get them in, but they could not stop. And he said, that's what my brother Bobby remembers. So it was so sad that we could not pick any of these men up. So, I remember that part of the story well. And then I had a brother in the South Pacific, Jack, and he worked on telescopes and all kinds of stuff like that. And he was getting ready to come home. They said he was coming back to the States, and he was getting ready to get board ship at the Indianapolis. And they called him back. They said, we need you. We still need you here. Well, in the meantime, when that ship took off, it was torpedoed, and most of the men died. They were ate by sharks, and that was an awful sad thing. But that's what I remember about the World War II right there. In fact, I'll never forget it.
Well, I was quite young, but World War II affected everybody's daily life, even a little kid at the time, because you were very aware of it. It wasn't like subsequent wars where it was in the background in the news, but because it affected everyday life. There was a shortage of butter, of sugar. We were required to save tin cans and save the fat from cooking. You couldn't buy an automobile. You had to watch how much gas you used because gas was rationed. So it affected everybody's everyday life. And it was really, there were air raids where everything was in darkness. And you had to have dark shades on your house. And at school, we would go. At that time, there were multi-tiered buildings, most of them, and we would go down to the basement, and the teachers would have us in groups, and we would sing to pass the time. But it was everything. It was just really a part of. You were very aware that we were at war.
What was the scariest part of the time period?
I really wasn't aware of any fear. It seemed, and I don't remember any of my friends ever really being afraid. I guess the grown-ups were careful enough not to let us know how worried they were, and we just assumed, well, the United States will win, and they'll never bomb the United States, and it just wouldn't happen. And we really, I don't think most of us really. The full impact of it, of the horror of it. I don't think it really hit home with the youngster at the time that we had any great fear. I do remember the sadness. I can recall a friend of mine close enough that we would go to each other's houses to play, and I remember her mother had to wear this bandana around her head because she had the shock of losing two sons in the war. And I do remember that sadness because she wasn't like most mothers coming to greet us and so on. So just a distant figure in the background. So I do remember some of the sadness. And I remember in the movies at that time they had something called the March of Time. And the strings of refugees, the European refugees it was, as I recall, leaving their homeland and with the children, and they all looked so weary. And I do remember that sadness. But for the most part, I don't think the sadness touched us that much. We just complained a little bit about having to eat margarine instead of butter, and the things like just everyday things. We were aware, very aware of the war, but I don't think we really, most of the fear of it never really struck young people at the time.
The war, what I remember about it is during the war, there was many men. I lived what they called the west side of town. That was about 20 young men that was killed from that west side of town. So you can tell how sad it was. It was an awful tragedy. But one thing we always remember, one of my next door neighbor, him and my brother Jack, the one that was in the South Pacific, they were drafted, but they enlisted. And just as they were getting ready to leave, my neighbor, Philip, he decided he wasn't going. He was going to wait till he got drafted. Well, when he got drafted, he went to the war and he got sent overseas and he got killed. And it was so sad. I often think, maybe if he went with my brother at the time, maybe he'd been someplace else. And maybe he would have come back. But it was an awful sad time. During the war, it was an awful sad time for us all. You know.
And how did you feel when you heard we won?
Oh, I still remember it because it was very surprising to me. My dad said, "Oh, we have to go downtown right away," and I was surprised that we're going downtown for what? But when we got there, everybody was out. There were just crowds of people all out in the street, and everybody was happy and laughing, and it was like a big celebration just on my main street that I was so used to being so nice and quiet and an ordinary small town main street, and suddenly it was a big party down there. And how do you remember the end?
The end, it was very joyful. It was, in fact, we were all on the front porch. And my brother Bobby, that I told you went in on dropping the troops off on Normandy Beach, well, he was out of that war zone, and he was back in the States, and he was home on leave, and he had a friend of his that the two of them were in on the front porch, and that's when that message more or less came over, that the war was over, and I remember such joy. And naturally, we all said a prayer to thank God that it was over, that maybe all our troops, now most of them, would come back home.
Did your brothers come home before the war was over or after?
After the war was over, they came back. You know, they came back here, but they got discharged from the services when the war was over. They come back, but they spent quite a time in there.
Well, thank you so much for telling me about your experience.
You're very welcome. It's our pleasure.